This is an Israelite inscription that was found by Israeli archaeologists in northern Sinai. It depicts the tree of life, the Eitz Chaim, an ancient symbol of the interconnection of all life and the channel through which the blessings of heaven could descend to the earth. In the later tradition, the Eitz Chaim was applied to the idea of chokhmah, wisdom. Wisdom was a tree of life that could bring meaning and happiness to your life. Later on, wisdom became associated with Torah. And so Torah became the Eitz Chaim. Torah became our tree of life, something that gave us purpose and meaning. Well, it's also quite interesting that from the time of Darwin, scientists have employed the metaphor of the tree of life to the grand story of evolution. Now, when we take the wonderful tradition of Torah and we add it to modern science, we come up with what I like to call green Torah wisdom. A Jewish way of looking at how to live a sustainable and just life and how to try and meet the environmental crisis. Because the environmental crisis is real, and we can no longer stand by and do nothing. Inaction is no longer a choice. Climate change is coming to a tipping point. It's no longer whether we can stop it, but how we can mitigate it and make sure that it doesn't get worse. So I believe that green Torah wisdom can help us bring a just and sustainable life so that we can protect the tree of life that is our home, the earth. Now, how did I, as a rabbi, get involved in Jewish environmentalism? Well, about 30 years ago, when I was a young parent of twin 5-year-old girls, and in my first congregation, some of the members of my synagogue were very active in the environmental movement, and they wanted to know how to connect their Judaism with their environmental activism. Now, I was intrigued by this, so I began to talk to them about it, and I began to learn from scientists and scientific works about climate change. And I really began to get concerned because, after all, I learned that there was going to be sea level rise, there would be droughts and floods and species extinction, and that this would cause incredible instability in the world. Now, as a parent, this deeply disturbed me, and I worried about the future of my children's lives and the lives of their children when climate change would take hold, because at the time, I didn't think I would be around to see it. Now, here we are 30 years later. My children are adults and have children of their own. And climate change has already begun to be a serious problem on the earth. And so my concern for my children and my grandchildren has only grown. So I began over these last decades to try and really think about what it meant to be a Jewish or religious environmentalist. But before I get to that, I want to mention a couple other streams about how I got to here. It wasn't just about being a parent. It was also about being interested in the relationship between science and religion. And that's how I ended up becoming what is called an eco-theologian, trying to take environmental ideas and meld them with traditional Jewish theology. And also, I began to examine my own past, my spiritual life. And I realized that some of the greatest spiritual experiences I had ever had were in the natural world. I was born in Toronto, and I spent many summers at camp in Northern Ontario, where I went on canoe trips. And the memories of some of those experiences still inspire me today. And that connection to creation has only grown with time. The last thing that has impelled me in this is what you see here. The fact that the poor and people of color, who are the ones least responsible for doing the environmental damage, are the ones who suffer the most from environmental degradation. This is called environmental injustice. And my Jewish moral sense, based on the concept of tzedek, justice and equity, impels me to see this as a moral issue. And that's one thing I want to emphasize. Fighting climate change is a moral issue. So again, how do you become a Jewish environmentalist? Here are the three things. First of all, scientific knowledge. There is a deep respect, as you know, in our tradition for learning. And one of the things that we really must do is to really learn about this issue. And because our tradition has a profound respect for learning, Judaism has portrayed a rather positive attitude towards scientific knowledge. In fact, Moses Maimonides, one of our greatest sages, felt that the study of the natural world was a prerequisite to the spiritual life. He said that by doing that, we would learn, first of all, to generate in ourselves wonder and love at the wisdom of God's creation, but that it would also engender in us a sense of awe and humility, so that we would understand our place in creation and not be so arrogant about it. So scientific knowledge is really important as a first step. The second characteristic is long-term thinking. One of the things that we know is that what we are doing today to the environment will have lasting effects into the future and affect future generations. The carbon dioxide that we are using at this very hour will remain in the atmosphere between 50 and 1,000 years or more, thus affecting future generations. So long-term thinking is really important. And in the Jewish tradition, we're always talking about Lador Vador, from generation to generation. We are not only informed by our past, but we are always concerned with the Jewish future. Well, we should not only be concerned with the Jewish future, but also the future of all humanity when it comes to climate change. But long-term thinking is not only about policy and planning, it's also a moral idea. The classic definition of sustainability is that we should meet the needs of the present generation without jeopardizing the needs of the future generation. And you notice I said needs and not wants. And we often confuse the two. My 4-year-old granddaughter, Eliza, about a year ago, decided that if she told us she needed something instead of wanting something, it would get more traction with us. And we're always doing the same thing, aren't we? So long-term thinking is not only about policy, it's also morality. We have to understand that. Lastly, we have to understand that everything is interconnected. Now, this is, first of all, an actual fact. We are all sitting here, and around us, the biogeochemical cycles are going on with every breath we take. So literally, this is true, that everything is interconnected. And in our tradition, this is shown, in fact, in some of our most beautiful texts, some of the creation choir texts found in the book of Psalms, what the rabbis in the Talmud called the Seder Bereshit, the order of creation, which is beautiful and harmonious. But interconnectedness is not only a scientific fact or a spiritual idea. Again, it is a moral idea. When we buy something, when we consume things, it's not an amoral act. We have to understand that what we buy, how it was made, where it came from, how the people who made it were treated, and the whole process's impact on the environment is something that is all morally interconnected. Now, there's a midrash that really expresses this. But first, before I tell you the midrash, I want to show you that this sense of interconnection is something that we have lost, right? Because after all, if it was 200 years ago, and I wanted to buy a pair of shoes, I would go to the village shoemaker, who was probably somebody I knew, who would get his leather from a local farmer and make me a pair of shoes. Well, today I can buy a pair of shoes without ever seeing a live human being. With a few clicks of my mouse, I can get a pair of shoes from who knows where, made by who knows who, under who knows what circumstances. So this midrash, I think, really reflects this idea of interconnectedness in a moral level. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, it is to be compared to people who were traveling in a boat. And one of them took a drill and began to drill underneath him. His companion said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "What do you care? Am I not drilling under myself? It's my seat." And they said, "But you will flood the boat for us all." We are truthfully and morally all in the same boat. And we have to understand that when we do things. So, how do we solve this problem? I think that we should do what I have called green Torah wisdom that will help to preserve the tree of life that is our world. So here are 3 possible points. First of all, the value of emet, truth. Try and find out the real facts of climate change. Educate yourselves on what really is going on. And that's not so difficult to do. Secondly, cultivate the idea of tzedek, justice and equity. Become an advocate for governmental action on a local, state, and national basis. Thirdly, follow the mitzvah of Bal Tashchit and also practice the spiritual practice of bracha. Bal Tashchit is an actual mitzvah that tells us we are not allowed to wastefully consume creation. And we can fulfill this by a number of things. We should eat lower on the food chain, less meat and fish and dairy, less brisket, more broccoli. We should try and, of course, be energy efficient in our homes and communities. We should try and buy our power from sustainable sources. We should try to reduce toxic chemicals and materials from our homes and synagogues. And we should try to reduce the amount of things we buy. Really understand what we need instead of what we want. And when we're finished with something, we should either have it reused or recycled. Now, bracha is a spiritual practice where we try to really understand and not take for granted any moment of our life. A bracha gives us a spiritual pause to really appreciate the world and what we have and what we are. And as you know, there are many brachot in our tradition, and people can write new ones. You know, one of my favorite brachot is the one you say when you come out of the bathroom. You may laugh, but the bracha says it's thanking God that all the parts are working correctly. And you know, the older I get, the more I appreciate that bracha. I want to conclude with one more thing. One of the most popular concepts in Judaism over the last 40 years is the idea of tikkun olam, repairing the world, which I interpret to be a moral imperative to repair what we have broken in the world. Now, there's a midrash that Jewish environmentalists have been using now for almost 30 years. In this midrash, God shows Adam and Eve around the Garden of Eden and tells them, this is all for you. All this beautiful thing is for you, but if you damage it or destroy it, there will be no one else to repair it but you. In other words, the fate of creation is in our hands. The future of the life itself is in our hands. There will be no supernatural escape from our folly. So I want to conclude with one more image. This is a tree found at the Arava Institute in Israel. Some years ago, a plant biologist was given some seeds by archaeologists that they had found at Masada. These seeds were 2,000 years old. She tried to germinate them, and one of them germinated. It's grown into this, an extinct species of date palm that was once plentiful in ancient Judea. To me, this is a powerful symbol of Tikkun Olam, where we have taken scientific knowledge, green Torah wisdom, and we can truly apply it to repair the world that we have broken and live a just and sustainable life through green Torah wisdom. Thank you.
Thanks for watching Eli Talks. Click through or subscribe to the Eli Talks channel for more inspired Jewish ideas.